We're here today with Thomas Anderson Jr., who is the pastor of Shiloh Hills Fellowship. And I guess you could say Shiloh Hills is a sister church to New Day because we both belong to the same association called Converge. And so I'm really grateful to have this conversation. I think there are some unique things that Thomas brings to a conversation about race and faith that I'm really eager to get into. But anyway, thanks for doing this, Thomas. And maybe just as we get started, could you give a little brief bio of your family and who you are, just so people could get to know you a little bit?
Absolutely. And once again, privilege and honor to be here with you, Jeff, and speaking to the New Day family. And we're praying for all of you. So it's exciting to be able to help along the journey. As you mentioned, Jeff, my name is Thomas Anderson Jr. I was actually born and raised in New York City. And so I'm from the East Coast there. I'm married to my wife of going on 11 years. Her name is Ruth. We met in upstate New York at a small little Bible college. We have two children, Carmen, Thomas III. Carmen is 8. Thomas III is 5. And so this is kind of a new transition for us. They're both in school. Our schools started meeting back up around their age groups. And so, you know, my young family is growing and new stage here. You remember those days, just you're real busy. You're physically tired a lot, but it's fun, right? It's the most fun we've had as a family. We're seeing them grow.
How long have you been at Shiloh Hills?
It'll be 3 years on February 12th. So I'm coming up on the 3-year mark here.
Yeah. And I said at the beginning that you're kind of in a unique place to bring some perspective to us. And I think part of that is because this isn't the first church where you have been the black pastor of a primarily or predominantly white congregation. So talk a little bit about that and if that feels like a unique calling to you and kind of how that has developed for you.
Oh, it's good. So I've been in full-time ministry about, over a decade, let's say about 12 years or so, and believer for 20-ish years. My first 10 years, I was in all black church, right? Saved in a charismatic, historical black church, served in that way, ordained in that, kind of grew up that tradition, that culture in New York City. And then God, and we always say like God has a sense of humor, then God kind of moved me to predominantly white spaces. So I went from even the university I was attending, which was a mixed or diverse university. I ended up going to an all-white small Bible college, ended up going to an all-white, slightly larger seminary. And then from that point on, I was on the train to being with my brothers and sisters of a lighter hue. We just journeyed together. And so my first lead pastor role was a rural country church in Pennsylvania. When I say rural, my 80-year-old deacon was carrying and reloading his own shells. You know, they're taking off the first day of school to go hunting, you know, the season, they're doing all the things. So it was foreign to me, both ethnically, that culture, and also like geographically, culturally. Like I was not familiar with it, but I learned a lot there. From that, I went to Florida and New Jersey, pastored. I wasn't lead at that point, but pastored in predominantly white spaces, and then moved out to Spokane, where I am now. That's predominantly white, the area, not fully, but predominantly. And then got the Shiloh position here where, when I showed up, my wife and I brought the diversity. Maybe there was 1 or 2 more individuals here, but definitely there were no committed, faithful, regular attending African-Americans or Latinos. My wife is from Guatemala, first generation, but her parents are from Guatemala. So there was no Latin Americans. And so, we made up for a while the bulk of it, and we're slightly seeing that change, but the demographics of North Spokane still is primarily white. And so that's our population.
What maybe was the biggest surprise to you in switching from being in a predominantly black church culture to mostly white? What can you identify anything that just felt immediately different?
If you got a core group of friends or people who just know you, right? Like they know your vernacular, they know the idioms you use, you just feel at home and safe with. it was like being in that kind of environment for so long. We could make the same jokes, have the same customs, enjoy the same type of things. Then you move to a different context where you'll say something, and not only was it foreign to the people you're talking to, sometimes it was rejected.
Mm.
So I can't remember what it was. Oh, I would say something about being in the city or loving cities. And it's one thing for people to be like, oh, we love hiking or the country or different things, especially out here in Spokane. Everyone loves to hike, which is fine. But you would notice that there would be a disdain almost sometimes for certain things that were cultural norms for me.
Mm.
For worship, I love to raise my hands during worship. And I know that's a big thing for some people. Oh, they don't want to. Well, it was one thing to say, that's not really what we do or I like. But another thing to kind of press in and do something like, well, those people who do that, you people, when you start categorizing and labeling people like that, and this is what I noticed when I went cross-cultural, it was like, oh, wait a minute, there's a heart issue there. Why are we labeling? They're believers, right? So that was probably the biggest surprise, to see how much of a heart issue some of the conversations drudged up.
What about being in that kind of setting compelled you to stay there, as opposed to saying, forget this, I'm going back to a Black church?
Man, compelled is a great word. I'm still asking God sometimes. and that's a very honest and vulnerable answer. Here's what I mean. I would love to say I'm going to go back to a city, or I'm going to head to a people group that feels familiar. I was talking to one of my elders days before, actually, we just recorded, we got together for this. And he reminded me of the story I shared about how I ended up at Shiloh. And I'll just share it briefly. I didn't want to be at Shiloh at one place. I worked for Moody Bible Institute that was in Spokane. They decided to close the campus I was working at. So I was like, hey, we're out of a job, but I didn't sweat it. I was gonna go back east. I love the East Coast. I want to be somewhere warm. So I'm ready to do Southeast. Like, I'm tired of snow, all the things. I preached at Shiloh to fill the pulpit, nothing more. They didn't have a pastor. I knew that. I didn't care. I got in the car. My wife looked at me, and my wife goes, you should consider applying. And when she does this, I know she's hearing from God. So I end up, what do we do when we hear from God? We ignore it, right? I'm like, I don't want to do that. I'm like, woman, stop it. And we laugh, we drive away. And God impressed upon me the need of this church, of the community, in a way that I could not ignore. If it was up to me, Jeff, I would have gone home. I'd have gone east. So the compelled piece was really the obedience of just, I don't know why, I don't know what for reason. And so my elder was reminding me, going, if God, God called you here, you can't move and leave until he dismisses you. And so when things get really hard, we saw it last summer in our culture, in our nation,
Yeah.
Things got tough for us as a church, because I spoke a lot about that.
Yeah.
I wanted to leave, but I knew I couldn't because God hadn't released me yet.
Yeah. Talking about last summer, I think there could be an assumption that a church that hires a Black pastor has got the reconciliation thing down. They've made their commitment, and yet diversity doesn't automatically equal agreement there. Talk a little bit about what this last year has been like in particular.
Yeah, that's good. So most of the times when a church hires a pastor, they hire a preacher, not the person. And it's weird to say that. They hire you because you sound good and they've seen you over a couple of weeks maybe, but they don't really know you and all the values. So the church didn't know how passionate I was about biblical justice. I said those things. I said the language of biblical reconciliation. So not just amongst ethnic groups, but within marriages, within families, within friends, like the whole concept. They heard that. It sounded good until I started actually pursuing it and pushing it. The summer came, and really the catalyst for us was George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd.
Sure.
It wasn't that these things didn't happen before, and it wasn't that I didn't even speak about them. I was nervous and scared to take it at church level, recognizing while I'm the pastor, I'm still seen. In fact, was told this by one person, you're still just a Black guy, right? I would go into board meetings, and I'm very expressive. You see my hands moving now. I would go into board meetings. I would watch other men do that. Everything would be fine. I would do it, everyone would respond poorly. I would be pulled aside sometimes. Hey, you're a little too aggressive. And one of my good friends who was on the board came to me finally and said, the guys are intimidated by you.
Mm.
I'm the smallest guy in the room. What do you what do you mean intimidate? Well, you put two and two together a little bit. Okay, I'm doing the same things. What's a little different? And I would have those conversations with them. Full circle, George Floyd hits. I go, I got to disciple my people on this.
Yeah.
We've got to work through this. We've got to figure out how to talk as a nation. Because I'm watching you on social media, some of my people, and I'm watching them throw dangerous and unbiblical words out. In fact, sounding no different than the world sometimes. It's not right. Yeah. So we made a video that, my 15 minutes of fame, it went viral. I think we had like 65,000 views. Churches are calling us, asking me to use them. People are emailing us, telling us I'm terrible, I'm a racist, all the things. And this is where it got hard. My church wrestled with this. We had core people in our church who loved it, embraced it, wanted to learn more. We had core people in our church who questioned whether I was a believer or not. It was a really hard season. The elders had to put a lot of intentional work into being biblical, to surrounding ourselves with prayer so we can remain unified, become unified again, which we are now, and it's beautiful. But in that time, I did the George Floyd video. I did a short series called Divine Diversity. I'm bringing that back in a form of a podcast shortly. And so I'm going to keep speaking about the things. I'm not shying away from them, but I know it's not a message received by everyone. And that's unfortunate.
I think in conversations we've had in the past, one of the things that's that I've appreciated about how you've gone about your ministry is the ability to stay engaged with people even when they are disagreeing with you. And how have you been able to do that?
The work of Christ is such a beautiful thing. It really is. And I'm not trying to sound super holy. It really is the gospel. And here's what I mean. I just can't fathom Paul telling the church at Ephesus that they are one new man, that there's this reconciliation between Jew and Gentile because of what Christ did. And when he wrote the letter and when they read it, I don't think it made sense right away. Right? I realized the reason he had to write it was because there was problems. And so if he can tell this church where there's already issues and problems, there'll continue to be issues and problems, but he knows the gospel has an answer for it. I'm compelled then to keep moving towards my brothers and sisters in love because we're unified in Christ. In fact, in Ephesians 4, chapter 4, he says that to pursue above all things unity of the Spirit. And so it's hard. Absolutely. I got to stay grounded in my word. I've got to stay grounded in prayer. But it's an absolute must for me to continue to move forward. So even when I have a misunderstanding, even if we disagree on this issue, it doesn't mean we're disconnected in the faith. And so I can continue to serve with you. I continue to love you, whether or not we agree on this.
For us, I think where people seem to struggle the most is the jump between thinking about myself and my own sense of, I am not racist. I want everybody to love each other and love the Lord. But when you make that jump to thinking about maybe society at large, or that word systemic racism, that feels like it's been difficult for people to wrap their heads around. I was just curious what has been at the heart of conversations that you've had there.
And you're nailing a lot of it. The problem shows up when we start using terminology that has, one, been defined poorly or hasn't been defined well, or two, we don't know the definition. We think we know it and we use that. How would you define racism? Well, this is the difference. You've got black and brown people who are going to define it very differently than white people. White people will say, my interactions would say, like, I know the KKK. I think of racists. I think of like Proud Boys, right? Nazi Germany. That's racist. Because I'm not that, I'm not racist. Well, the problem with all of that is that's actually just not a good definition of it. Sure. Right. And that's not a good framework to think of it. So I've learned, and we can do that. I can help clarify what I would use. And when I use racist, what do I mean by it? I think, a good definition. And then the same thing for systemic racism, right? And I remember one of my elders, I explained what systemic racism was, and he looked at me and went, huh, I thought it meant I was a racist because I'm white. And I was like, nope, not what it means. And I'm sorry, catch what this, I said to him, and I'm sorry for anyone who's ever made you feel that way. That's nothing. I didn't make him feel that way. I didn't call him that. But because I'm a part of a cultural movement that's using that terminology, and because I want to empathize with him, I just stepped into that and was like, dude, I'm sorry if that happened. I'm noticing that's the other part of a contention. A lot of people don't want to talk about and admit the realities of our culture, of history. And here's what gets interesting. I'm seeing from white people, believers who love the Lord. You know, World War II, Pearl Harbor, American Revolution, all the historical events we love, you get the we pronoun used. We did this. We're awesome. We were that. When we talk about the parts of history we don't like, the argument I would get with, well, I wasn't there. Why am I being blamed? And I just said, that sounds kind of duplicitous. You want the benefits and the rewards of all the success, but you don't want to take the responsibility of the failures. Mm-hmm. I think we got to do both. I think the church, we've done this in the church, right, Jeff? We love the Reformation. We want to talk about the wonderful things we've got because of church culture, but we don't talk about the Crusades. Sure. We're not talking about, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like, right. No, there's good and bad that's happened.
Right.
We can learn from both. So I think those are the big contentions. Definition, understanding history and how it plays in. We have a problem with that as Westerners anyway. And then the willingness to want to work for reconciliation. I think that's the last thing I see. Even if the world is different than what we say it is, you got brothers and sisters who are hurting.
Right.
It's much easier to write them off than step into their pain.
Yes. Yeah.
And people aren't willing to step into pain. They're just, well, you know what? I didn't do anything. It's not me. Let's not talk about this. Well, you can do that. I can't.
Yeah, I think what you said there about definitions is key because it makes a really easy way for people to just dismiss something immediately. If they categorize it with a poor definition, then they're not going to listen past that to any of the argument behind it or the pain behind it. So I would be really curious to hear. You said you had a good or better definition of racism and systemic racism. So just in a nutshell, if you could share how you operate from.
Yeah. So, and there's a resource I like. So let me start with that even. Divided by Faith is a fantastic resource. It's going to be, if you're not a history buff, the beginning is going to be very historical, just give you some framework for it. But it's very good at helping you understand what a racialized society is, how does race and systematically play in, and a couple of things that come up. So I can circle back to give you that. But here's what I would do. I would first define prejudice, because prejudice, racism, and systemic racism work together but function differently. I'd first define prejudice, which we all have, by the way. Okay, if you meet an individual, Jeff, that says, I am not prejudiced, you just met a liar. And I say that in love. We deceive ourselves, okay? We all have bias. Prejudice is simply a prejudgment of an individual based on a particular caricature or stereotype. That's it, okay? Whether we make it about women drivers, whether we make it about ethnic groups and how frugal they are, number of things, we all have a bias, okay? If I showed up in this meeting with my long hair now, because I used to have cut short hair. If I show up in this meeting with a hoodie on, okay, there's a bias, right? Sure. That's not racism. That's not systemic racism. It's prejudice. It's a bias. Here's the problem. Someone will call an individual racist for having those thoughts, and this is where the whole topsy-turvy world comes. So that's prejudice. Then we move to racism. A couple of definitions thrown around. I'll land on them. One author will say prejudice plus power is racism. Okay, prejudice plus power. And I know that power word we don't like, but really all it means is I can be prejudiced against you but until I go to oppress you, I haven't done anything racist. So racist is now more of the act than just a thought or feeling, right? So why was the KKK racist? Because they would take people from their homes and lynch them. They now would take their bias, mix it with action, power over somebody, and cause harm. Now you got racism, right? Why is Hitler and the regime racist? Well, because they would take action. There was power behind it. In that book, Divided by Faith, they'll say that it's a collective misuse of power and it diminishes life opportunity, right? So racism in itself is almost seen as being systemic in that it flourishes and thrives in a society because it's a collective misuse of the things going on. This is why we can look at early history in America or Jim Crow era and say that it was racist because there was a system that oppressed people intentionally. So laws created for that, right? So what that means is you wouldn't be racist, but you can be complicit in racist act, right? Or in a systemic racism, racist system. You can be complicit if you allowed something to go on. The argument's no different, by the way, if we talk about life in the abortion context where, you know, people feel like if you vote for Democrats, then you're voting for, right, you're complicit. It's the same type of narrative. We like to use it in one area. We just don't like to use it holistically, right? What we're going to say is, and this is true of anything, no matter what party you vote for, you're complicit in something you don't agree with by proxy. It's the same reality and idea.
Right.
What I like to tell people, and I've done this illustration, so forgive me if this is triggering. Let me say that. Forgive me if this is triggering to anyone, but I think it gets the point across. Imagine, and so Jeff, we'll use you because real person talking with you. Sure. Imagine, Jeff, when you were a child, you found out that your mom or someone, a woman in your family was being abused by a male. Okay. Some kind of way.
Yeah.
That impacts the way you think. Impacts how you treat women, impacts what you think of men, male figures, right? There's trauma that occurs.
Right.
Okay. You don't get any help for that trauma. Impacts you. You respond because of it, but you don't get any help. You grow up with that trauma. And now you have a family. Doesn't mean you become like your father. You may be the opposite way. Pendulum might swing the opposite way, right? But now you've got these big emotions that express out in this, manifest in these expressions, and the trauma hasn't been resolved. What do your kids see? Okay? That trauma impact them. They never witnessed what you witnessed, but it impacts them, right?
Right.
And you see that as a pastor. There's generations of trauma from substance abuse, different things. We're familiar with that, okay? I want you to take a similar posture now. If that is real, I want you to take a similar posture in terms of trauma. We talk about slavery and the racism then. 1619 to 2021 is 402 years. Okay? Let's make it even. I like even numbers, 400 years. Hey, not, just give it a two. 246 of those years, so more than half, slavery. That means less than half the time the country has been around, slavery was common. When there wasn't slavery, there was Jim Crow, legalized segregation, right? My dad has stories as a kid knowing he could not use the same bathroom as white people. That's how close this is, by the way. My dad's only in his 60s. So what I'm trying to say is that for easily 300 plus of the 400 years, you got a history of trauma. It could be utopia right now, which it isn't. It's a broken and fallen world. It doesn't mean the trauma's gone. It doesn't mean a group of people have been helped through and worked through it. It doesn't. And what we're doing is we're telling people to get over generational trauma, not because it's actually in their best interest. That'd be one thing if we walked into it going, hey, this is actually being your best interest. We're not taking a counseling standpoint. We're going, can you get rid of it because I don't want to talk about it? Because it makes me feel bad. Time out, first of all, and I don't believe any of this should be directed towards a white person living like, You didn't own slaves, Jeff. I don't blame you for that, right? So hear that. I'm not on that side of things.
Right.
I know some people are. But it's interesting that we want people to stop talking about it because it doesn't make us feel good. Imagine me doing that as a pastor and counselor. Hey, can you not mention your critiques and your problems with the church? It doesn't make me feel good. Can you just stop?
Yeah.
So I just don't think we recognize that. That's how I respond. I start with it as going, I know this is hard for you, but this is hard for some other people because for the majority of history, all the narrative that's been passed down hasn't been a pretty one. Which means, by the way, if I'm looking at 300 years of a organized system designed to oppress people, that doesn't change overnight. Right?
Right.
When's the last time a person changed overnight, let alone an entire society? Right? There's a reason why big business still is booming, although everyone or a lot of people say they can't stand big businesses. There's a reason why they boom, because it's really hard to change practices overnight.
Mm.
Now we're talking about laws, and we know how the government works. It just takes time. Now we talk about an infrastructure that's far greater than any one of us. That doesn't change over just a decade or a century even.
Right. That's a really helpful context, I think, to put it in the language of trauma. That's helpful. Thank you for that. I think it brings up another point, though, that when it is something that is so large and so deeply ingrained, then I think when we're encouraging people to engage with it, I think it feels really overwhelming and so beyond people that they don't know what they can do if they're not a lawyer, if they're not a political, activist in that sense. What do you encourage your church, just the person in the pew, in terms of staying in the conversation and being engaged? Where do you direct them? What do you say to that?
The first thing we start with, and this is going to depend on where you're starting your journey, right? So while I'm going to say some things, be sensitive that someone's journey may be further along, someone's journey may not be as far as long. So there's grace in there. The first thing I start with is it's just for believers, is just the gospel again. And the reason I say that is you've got to understand the worth and value of your brothers and sisters who have a differing opinion in you to move you towards empathy. I could say start with empathy, but unless you actually understand the biblical framework for that and why that's a value, I'm just saying words. So start with recognizing that even though you disagree with someone, they're still children in the eyes of God, who's loved by God, called according to his purpose, and he's working in their lives. So we can disagree on this and still be family. Then develop empathy for family, going, okay, I don't see it your way. I don't even know if I buy it, but it hurts you. Tell me more about that hurt. I don't want you hurting. If it's genuine, I don't want you hurting. So now, being a body of believers who bear one another's burdens and come alongside each other to encourage and spur each other to good works, how can I help you navigate the reality of your pain and spur you on to live godly life? I got to step into it a little bit. Okay. Notice right now, there's nothing political, right? I'm not saying that there's no protest you need to go to. It's literally dealing with real people. By the way, if I can throw a caveat in, that's the beauty of the body, is God calls us to engage with one another in real time with real issues as we serve a risen and real Savior. What Satan wants to do is disconnect us. That's why 2020 was so hard. If I can disconnect you from your brother and sister, and you now not call them a child of God, but label them something else, you don't see them as a person. You don't value who they are. You don't see them as a fellow believer. And now you can just label them and crush them. Let's get rid of that. So start with the gospel, really develop some empathy, move towards people in empathy, sit in that pain, bear the burden, love on them. If you can do that well, then I think the next step is actually helpful, because then you can begin to learn. My wife shows up, and Jeff, you've been married for years. My wife over the years has communicated things I do not understand. I wish I could tell you I did. I did. All right. She's got feelings and emotions that Lord bless her. I don't always get it. And you know what I used to do early in my marriage? I used to be like, that doesn't seem like a big deal. You ever done that, Jeff? You ever?
Oh, maybe a long time ago, but
Right. Not recently. You ever hit your wife with one of those? Nah, come on, babe. Or the immediate, well, if you just did this, it'd be over. That's not what she needed. Never helps. That's kind of this issue. I had to learn her pain. Why does this hurt you when this person does this? Why did this bother you in such a way? And recognize that there's beauty in the diversity, right? We let culture hijack the word diversity to mean forcing Black and brown people into white spaces and everyone's unhappy. I look at diversity as a biblical mandate that God is saying all peoples over the world should be bowing before the Messiah, before Jesus, and it brings him glory when that happens. And that's not just an ethnic division, male, female, culturally, right? All over the place. And so I can have a diverse thought for my wife and still worship God, and it honors him more when we get along in that sense. That's where learning takes place. That's when you go, maybe you got something to offer. Maybe there's something I'm missing. So that's the like short, probably didn't seem short, but short, simple way to jump in. If you're already there, then your learning stage starts with reading some books, developing the heart and passion to defend the voiceless. I think the Bible talks about that when we talk about biblical justice. But I don't want to go too far, too fast. So there is another step, but I think we can come back to that maybe down the road.
Are there one or two examples from your own relationships within the church that have been really encouraging to you in the last stretch?
Yeah, the big one I'll give is my staff. So my staff, once again, predominantly white church, all white staff. Then you got me as the lead pastor. My staff, pretty unaware, ignorant on this topic and subject and all the ins and outs, right? Know that they would say racism's bad and wrong. No real clue, nothing there. They saw deep pain in me over the summer, and many of my staff pressed in. They all listened. I got about 2 of them who pressed in, would check on me daily. How you feeling today? What hurts? Why does this hurt? Became protective of me first and foremost, which moved them to then learning and wanting to educate themselves. That was beautiful because they went back to the Bible and said, man, this does seem like Jesus is inviting all cultures to him. This does look like Paul saying, reconciliation's key, and then getting frustrated going, why haven't I been taught this? Then moving towards their families. I want to teach my kids this. I want my kids to understand it. So that was really encouraging when people can draw close to you, see who you are, see who God is and has done in you, and then move to model that in their families. That's been really encouraging.
That's really cool. I want to go back. You mentioned that this podcast that you're starting, if people were interested in hearing more about what you're doing, what's going on there with that?
So what we learned doing this summer is that the church, like I said, they wrestled with a lot of this. And so while I don't want to be an immediate burden on them, my elders and I are still working through some issues there. I still feel biblically responsible to talk about this. So we started a podcast. I say myself and my brother started a podcast called Divine Perspective, to where we're really going to have a larger framework. We're going to talk about that very topic. How do we have this perspective shift in our culture? Okay. We want to help God's people understand his purpose, so that way his people can live with purpose. I think often we get so culturally based and minded, we forget what God says and why he says and how we should live out against our culture. So the podcast is named Divine Perspective. We'll have a series in that, a season in that called Divine Diversity, where we're going to discuss particularly issues of this nature and how we take a biblical perspective shift on it. If you want to find that, it launches Friday, February 5th. So it kind of goes live then. And so that is. And so you can catch it on, we're going to try to go for like Apple Podcast, all the places you would find your podcast. You can look it up. The easiest way probably right now is going to be going to mrtandersonjr.com, which is the website. And then it'll have a player on there that you can listen to it, but you should be able to find it on all the podcast places. Divine Perspective, again, is the name of that.
As we get ready to wrap this up, is there anything else that you would want to encourage New Day with as we close?
Yeah, absolutely. Be comfortable, which is weird, right? But be comfortable with awkward. Learn to get comfortable with weird and awkward, and learn to be okay not being able to fix things. Here's what I mean by that. When you have these conversations, it's going to be awkward. Jeff, I got to imagine it's incredibly awkward when you reached out to me and we started talking to ask some of the questions. You want to be careful. I don't say the wrong thing and I don't want to offend. Guess what happens in relationships? We offend each other. But what should happen in healthy relationships? We reconcile.
Sure.
Right? So don't be so worried and so wrapped up in your own mind, being self-centered, thinking, I don't want to be wrong. I would rather be loving and make mistakes and reconcile than not say anything, but hey, I didn't offend.
Sure.
That's not genuine relationships. And so I just want to encourage New Day that as you press in to ask questions, if you know any Black and brown people, even if you ask questions of your own family and just trying to figure things out, it's not going to feel comfortable. Of course, it doesn't feel natural. We're in a broken world. Healthy relationships aren't natural. The only thing that comes natural are broken relationships. But the Spirit of God is with you. For those of you who accepted Christ, God lives in you, which means he's powering you to live biblically. We can always reconcile when we make mistakes.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time for this. It's really helpful, and I hope it's actually just the first of many conversations.
Absolutely.
I liked that you said maybe we can come back to some of those other steps a little further down the road. But in the meantime, I know that you're a busy guy with also working on your doctorate and so many other things going on in your life. So I really appreciate you making time for this. And yeah, God bless you and all you got going on, and look forward to hearing that podcast.
Amen. Lord bless you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.